Genetics is the study of inheritance and specifically how traits are inherited. Traits can be physical characteristics such as size, coloration, or blood type. Traits can also include behaviors or predispositions to disease. Many traits are controlled either wholly or partially by genes, which are carried on chromosomes. Diploid organisms such as humans have two copies of each type of chromosome, including 22 pairs of autosomes and a pair of sex chromosomes. Recall that genes are unique sequences of DNA that code for a functional product. Generally, we think of genes as coding for a protein. The sequence of DNA is the string of bases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, or A, T, C, and G. Genes can exist in different variants, which we call alleles. For example, here is just a small part of a particular gene, which is called insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor, or IGF-1R. The sequence that you're seeing here is somewhere in the middle of the gene. On the top, we have one allele of IGF-1R, which I've designated as allele 1. You can see the sequence of A's, T's, C's, and G's. Below that is a second allele of IGF-1R. The dots mean that the base is identical to the base in allele 1. Therefore, what you can see here is that the allele is exactly the same except at one particular position, in which allele 1 has a G, or guanine, and allele 2 instead has an A, or adenine. Allele 2 is the result of a mutation. Specifically, this is a point or substitution mutation, because one base has been substituted for another. In terms of what happens to the amino acid sequence, this mutation is a missense mutation because it changes arginine to histidine. So the protein product that's produced from this IGF-1R gene has exactly the same primary sequence of amino acids, except that at this one particular position, allele 1 codes for an arginine and allele 2 codes for a histidine. Does this have an effect on the protein structure and the phenotype of the organism? Well, the answer in this case is yes. These alleles were identified in domestic dogs, and it turns out that very small dogs have allele 2, while large and medium-sized dogs have allele 1. Now, dogs, like humans, are diploid, so they have two copies of IGF-1R. They might have two copies of allele 1, in which case we would call them homozygous for allele 1. They might have one copy each of allele 1 and allele 2, and in that case we would call them heterozygous, or they might have two copies of allele 2, in which case they would be homozygous for allele 2. The smallest dogs tend to have two copies of allele 2, such as the ones you see here. Many genes have multiple alleles or variants that exist in the population. However, any given diploid individual will have two copies of a gene. These copies might be the same allele, or they might be two different alleles. When we talk about genetics, we use these two words frequently, genotype and phenotype. Phenotype refers to the observable traits that are expressed by an organism, while genotype refers to an organism's underlying genetic makeup. Let's use our dogs as an example. The phenotype of this Chihuahua includes being small in size. The genotype of this Chihuahua, on the other hand, is that it has two copies of IGF-1R allele 2, or we could also say that it's homozygous for IGF-1R allele 2. And just a quick reminder where these alleles come from. Genes are inherited from parents. Recall that in diploid organisms such as humans, we inherit one copy of each type of chromosome from our mother and one copy of each type of chromosome from our father. In organisms like us, these chromosomes are contained in the gametes that are produced by meiosis. They combine in the zygote, which has two copies of each type of chromosome, and therefore two copies of each gene, which may be two copies of the same allele or two different alleles.